Hello, my name is Carlos McWhorter, and welcome to the Roadmap to Wealth podcast. And this is episode 3 of this podcast, where we will be talking about the helplessness that we feel sometimes when it comes to handling our finances, and how this helplessness is sometimes a learned behavior. And we'll also be talking about how to combat this learned behavior. I was thinking about how we often don't link the consequences to the actions when it comes to our money. A lot of times there's a gap between the time that we end up spending too much money and the time that we feel it. And when we have the consequence, yes, common sense says that it's because you spent too much, but because of that time gap between the two incidents, we fail to link the action to the consequence. And then we end up in a cycle where we keep making the same mistake over and over and over again because we fail to make the link between the two. And what I mean is, let's say you go shopping and you end up spending too much. You might be okay that week or that month. You might be able to survive that. But when you do that, sometimes you don't think ahead to what could happen in the future, and you keep doing that. And then next thing you know, you have a car breakdown. Maybe you have a death in the family and you have to do some traveling. And then the action and the consequence could be months apart, and you are in this bind again, and you've been in this bind before, but you didn't do the things that were necessary to avoid it this time. So how do you avoid this cycle? Or how do you even fall in this cycle in the first place? Sometimes we end up falling into this trap of learned helplessness. Now, of course, I got to hit you with a study. I love looking at studies, trying to unlock the mind in some of the ways that we process information to help me understand and hopefully help you understand how to avoid these mistakes in the future. Now, check this out about learned helplessness. I'll drop the link to this study in the description so you can check it out if you like to. According to the American Psychological Association, learned helplessness occurs when someone repeatedly faces uncontrollable, stressful situations and then does not exercise control when it becomes available. They have learned that they are helpless in that situation and no longer try to change it, even when change is possible. Then it goes on to say that once someone has experienced this, they often lose motivation. Even if an opportunity arises that allows the person to alter their circumstances, they do not take the action. Now, when I first read this, I started to immediately think about situations in my life where I might have felt stuck at a particular job, or I might have had difficulty with coworkers. And I can understand people might have issues with family, with friends, where you just kind of feel helpless. You feel like you cannot change the situation. We're thinking about finance or people who repeatedly find themselves in the same situation over and over again. I think this really applies and can help some people understand why they fall into a trap and then how to get out of this trap. Reading further, it says people who experience learned helplessness often are less able to make decisions. This reminded me of another study that talked about when people have financial stress, their thinking is actually altered because the financial stress is equivalent to sleep deprivation and just more difficult to make sound decisions when you're under that type of stress. So when you're in this trauma and you just feel like you're helpless, like it takes away your ability to make sound decisions. So sometimes we look at people and criticize, we might get down on them because they keep making the same financial mistake. And we don't think about their mindset and how they might just actually feel helpless. And that's the reason why they haven't done what's necessary to get out of the situation. They don't believe they can. And there's 3 main features of this learned helplessness thinking disorder is what they refer to it as. Becoming passive in the face of trauma, difficulty learning that responses can actually control trauma. Now, they did this experiment. Now, I understand this was a test that was done on dogs. I understand that this was in the 60s and this is probably not going to fly right now, but I'm just discussing what happened. It's not something that I did. Don't get mad at me. However, there were these dogs used for the experiment, and the dogs experienced a series of electric shocks. And there are 2 sets of dogs, ones that actually had a lever to turn the shocks off and others that didn't. So they noticed that the dogs that had the shock collar and could actually have control over the lever that controlled the shocks, they didn't exhibit any change of behavior, while the dogs that had no control over the shocks showed depression and signs of anxiety. And they also noted that the dogs that had no control over the shocks and showing signs of depression and anxiety, they had an ability to jump over a barrier and get away from the area where they would get shocked. But the dogs didn't even try. It's like they got accustomed to the shocks and they didn't try to stop it. They didn't try to avoid it. They just experienced it and allowed those shocks to impact them. So the study noted that they kind of had a learned helplessness about that situation. Here are some of the symptoms that they described as people who have a learned helplessness: a feeling of a lack of control over the outcome or situations, failing to ask for help, having low self-esteem, decreased motivation, putting less effort into tasks, lack of persistence, feelings of frustration, passivity, and giving up easily. And I think when it comes to finance, either we've experienced some of these things or we know people that have experienced some of these things. Things happen to them versus them having the ability to impact these things. So it says one of the causes is that it happens in response to stressful situations or traumatic experiences. And some of the experiences that they described, I can totally understand. Child neglect, abuse, physical violence within relationships, and other sorts of trauma. It makes sense. These are things that you can't control. And it's totally logical, of course, that you can just learn to be helpless in this situation, because many times you are helpless in these situations if you're going through this. But when it comes to finances, I can understand, because the human mind likes to take the easy way out. We will find pleasure in our minds, or at the very least, do our best to run away from the trauma. So sometimes accepting the situations that we're in is a way of moving away from that trauma or mitigating that trauma, especially if we learn that we feel that we don't have the ability to change our situations. Accepting the circumstances, accepting the things that cause the circumstances, and just believing that these things happen to you and that you have no control. I can see that as a defense mechanism that people fall into. But again, it's a trap, because it just keeps you in that same cycle of the things happening to you over and over and over again. And you just kind of shrugging your shoulders saying, oh, well, there's nothing I can do about it. And as I mentioned earlier, the medical professionals see this as a thought disorder. And this thought disorder leads to other disorders such as depression and anxiety. Now, how can we get out of this trap if we feel helpless about our finances? I think the number one way is to pay attention to how we think, and specifically, how do we think about the circumstances that put us in this bad situation? When you think about it, if you were to describe it, how would you describe it? Would you be pessimistic? Would you be negative? Or would you be optimistic about the situation? Would you take ownership of your role in the situation that you're in? Or would you speak about it as something that just happened to me? Now, if you're pessimistic about it, of course, you're going to see it as, this happened to me. The car broke down. Such and such got sick. We had to do this broke in the house. We had to get this repaired. In your mind, I'm sure you feel like you're explaining what happened, but you're really making excuses because you're not describing them in the way that you could describe them that helps you address the situation better the next time. I've learned to say, hey, I didn't budget for that. I didn't plan well enough for this incident. I didn't leave enough cushion to make sure we can handle these types of incidents when they popped up. Now, this is seen as an optimistic way of thinking. May not feel optimistic because you're still kind of describing the problem and you're taking ownership of the issue. However, it's optimistic because you're saying it in a way that addresses the problem, or in a way that you can address the problem the next time. If I say, well, the car broke down and we didn't have enough money for it, versus I did not have enough savings to handle the car breaking down, then in the future, I can take that experience, link it to the consequence, and then effectively put the money away so that I can handle that emergency in the future. So that's number one, making sure that we are seeing the situation as something that we could have impacted in the past, whether we knew it or not, or whether we believed it or not. Right now, when we look at these situations, we have to be able to identify them as situations that we could have impacted. And through that transformation, we'll begin to effectively see what we need to do differently so that we can control those situations in the future. And the last thing that needs to happen is also a mind shift change. When I was describing learned helplessness in the beginning, it talked about learned helplessness, and it says, even if an opportunity arises that allows a person to alter their circumstances, they do not take the action. Now, we know they don't take the action because they don't believe that there's actions that can be taken. They feel helpless. But another key thing is how we view the opportunities. When it comes to finances, a lot of the opportunities that we have don't feel like opportunities. They feel like consequences. And that's why we shy away from them. Now, looking at the definition of an opportunity, it says a set of circumstances that makes it possible to do something. The second definition, when I just Googled it just now, says a chance for employment or promotion. Many times we think about opportunities and we see them as something immediately positive, a promotion, a chance to advance, an opportunity to experience something that we haven't experienced before, an opportunity to meet someone. We think of it in those terms, but then we don't think an opportunity is saving money. Like when it finances, that's the opportunity that you have to change your situations. Save the money, invest the money, put the money away, do the right things with the money, take advantage of those opportunities. And then in the future, when you have these emergencies or when you're looking at, your retirement portfolio, you're set up because of the opportunities that you took before to not overspend, to make sure you're sticking to a budget, to have a plan, to make sure that plan aligns with your goals in the future, to have the right systems in place to keep you on track with that plan. All those things are opportunities, but a lot of times they look like work or consequences. They look like you're taking something away from yourself by not giving yourself what you want right now. But it's simply the gift and the opportunity of delayed gratification that allows you to have more in the future. So we have to start looking at the opportunities for what they really are and stop associating sound financial decision making with consequences or things that are negative. I understand it may not feel good at first. It may take some time to get used to it, but it's a necessary process that we all have to get to if we're in a negative financial situation in order to get out of the trap, out of the feeling of helplessness and into the feeling of control and actually impacting the financial circumstances that we experience. Often when we have these issues with finance is just the way, or money is just the avenue that the consequence or the issue, I should say, flushes out. Many times the problem stems from something else, whether it's self-esteem, whether it's some other sort of trauma, and it kind of just carries itself over. And when we become adults and we have money, we have to learn finances, some of our spending habits and bad relationships with management and budget and bad relationships with denying ourselves something that we want. Many times that stems from a stress or a trauma totally outside of money or the dollars that we spend. But this is just the way we kind of medicate it. This is the way that we kind of give ourselves a small dose of dopamine with the shopping or the dining or the travel or whatever it is that we enjoy to not deal with the real issue. Now, sometimes we do this consciously. Sometimes we do this subconsciously. We're in this trap of spending this money. We don't really know why. I say this because in this article towards the end from the American Psychological Association, they even suggest cognitive behavioral therapy as something to combat this feeling of learned helplessness. And it points out self-esteem, working through challenging emotions, addressing instances of neglect and trauma. And we all know these are things that many of us use money to combat, or we use spending in the ability to have something physical in our hands that we can kind of put our focus to, that brings our focus off of the other issues in our life that we actually need to address. So yeah, be more mindful of why you're making the financial decisions that you're making when you're in that trauma. Don't just make the bad decision and just feel like, okay, well, how am I going to get out of this situation? And you stay in that trap. Develop the habit of assessing why you're in the situation that you're in yet again, or even if it's the first time that you're in this particular situation, because we all know as life evolves, we have more and more financial obligations weighing on us as we grow into adulthood and we have kids, and kids get older and get bigger, and we have college. So there's always more financial decisions to be made. Even when we plan out our financial lives years in advance, sometimes priorities change. Sometimes events happen that derail us. And sometimes our thinking just evolves and we make adjustments to our plan. So we constantly have to be ready to make these financial decisions. But if you don't have the right mindset, it becomes increasingly difficult to make the sound decisions, especially when you're steady in the tight financial situation. It's so difficult to think about years ahead or even months ahead if you are not sure how you're going to make it through the week. Like, I see poor people get criticized a lot because of some of the financial decisions that they make. But again, if you don't know when your next meal is coming from, if you don't know how to make it to the end of the month, how can you expect somebody to set aside money for retirement for 20 years or 30 years from now when they're not sure about next month? It's not an easy thing to do. And in that situation, it's not even logical to think that far ahead when you got to focus on what's in front of you right now. And I say that to say that if you're in that situation, like, have some grace for yourself. Understand that it's not always easy, especially depending on the type of environment you grew up in the financial management of the household you grew up in and the people who raised you and influenced you. You may not have had a solid foundation coming into adulthood to have an understanding of money and what to do and what not to do. So you had to just figure it out by trial and error. Again, have grace for yourself. Understand that you're not alone. You're not the only person that has made mistakes or didn't know what to do early on in life. And sometimes you might just need to think about a year in advance and focus on that and get that down, and then graduate to thinking about 3 years and 5 years and 10 years down the road. So yeah, step one is just, again, figuring out, why am I here? What do I need to address? What emotions are driving me to make these decisions? What fear do I have? Why am I so uncomfortable putting a budget together? Is it because I don't want to see my financial mistakes face to face? And if that's the case, then why? Why are you scared of failing at something again? I was telling my wife, some people struggle with this because when they start to look at their finances in full light, they believe that they're going to see another one of their failures, and they have low self-esteem, so they can't afford to accept another failure. So they just kind of live on a whim. You know, they get paid, and they make sure they don't spend more than what they get paid. They really don't plan in the future, because doing so might mean you have to look at all of your mistakes and realize maybe you can't afford that house that you live in. Maybe you can't afford that apartment. Maybe you can't afford that car that you're driving. So you put yourself in this position where you don't really acknowledge financial mistakes. And when you don't acknowledge it, you don't address the things that you can do to control your financial situation. But again, some of these things have nothing to do with money, but the impact of these situations, these internal traumas and self-esteem issues and emotional issues that we have, kind of flush themselves out when we're looking at our finances. So again, make sure we're understanding why we're making the decisions that we're making. Learning to be introspective and taking a deep look into ourselves to find the issues. Understand that we have full control and we can impact our financial situations at any given time, as long as we end up changing our mindsets about these situations, and also changing our mindset about the actual opportunities that exist that allow us to address those situations. So I hope this podcast helped you in your journey of feeling helpless and susceptible to all the things that are happening to you financially. And hopefully we can start to transform into a powerful and competent person who understands that we have the power to impact every financial situation that we come across. This wraps up this episode of the Roadmap to Wealth podcast. I hope this podcast was helpful to you. And if so, please consider hitting the like button and subscribing to my YouTube channel. See you in the next video.